people here are related to him, to me. Others are friends that we've accumulated over the years. I'm supposed to talk, and I was procrastinating for the past month, and I'm very good at that. So I started to write this morning, and I said, oh, forget this. There's other people going to talk. Let's see, who's talking? His cousin's son, John Clark, is going to talk. Nicole is going to talk about how Walter influenced her life. Nicole is his granddaughter / daughter, one of the grandchildren that we raised. Michael is going to talk, touching on different things that affected his life over the years. My sister Mary is going to talk a little bit. Nobody's going to talk for long. It's not in school. It's not 40-minute periods. You don't have to worry too much. But Walt lived a lot of his life before I met him. He was in his 40s, and I was in my teens when we met. And it happened very, very strangely. My parents, for some unknown reason, sent me to Ireland to stay with distant cousins on a farm for 3 weeks. They had 8 children. I was the 3rd. They never sent any other children away to a foreign country. I don't know if that was indicative of anything, but I also didn't go away to college. I commuted to college, so the family moved to New Jersey. What? Luckily, I found their forwarding address. But I stayed for 3 weeks on a farm. I learned to milk cows by hand, and I loved every minute of it. When I came back, we had a summer house, and there was a beach at our lake, and across the street from the beach was a small farm. So one day, I got my sister's friend to walk with me because I was afraid. I had heard that the old man on that farm was crabby. That was not Walter. That was his father. And some of you can attest to Grandpa Wiggins. Anyway, I walked over there and I knocked on the barn door. Well, Grandpa Wiggins and Walter were in sweeping cobwebs in the barn, as you farmers know, is a routine behavior. They looked shocked. I didn't realize that people don't knock on barn doors. They just walk in. But I was a city kid from Brooklyn. What did I know? They came out and we talked, and Grandpa Wiggins asked me, I had mentioned I rode a horse in Ireland. Did I know how to ride? Well, they didn't believe me, so Grandpa Wiggins had Walter saddle up one of his horses, and I showed that I could ride. So he asked me to start training a 3-year-old gelding that he had. So I was over there every weekend, and my family moved up to New Jersey, so it continued. 2.5 years later, Walter and I got married. For the first 7 years of our marriage, we milked cows, and we did all the farm things. And one thing that was missing, we had no children. My daughter Lisa asked me one time why we didn't have children, and I said, it just didn't happen. And she said, why didn't you try again? But after 7 years, we adopted 3 children, Gordon, Warren, and Lisa. Lisa is here with one of her daughters and 3 of her grandchildren. A few years later, that was 1976. In 1979, we bought a farm in Montezuma, and we owned that farm until we sold it to Nevin and Eugene Forst in 10 years ago. Walter's life farming, when he first started, he farmed with horses, didn't have a tractor for the first year or so. And just thinking of the hay that he made, originally he made hay where the horses would put it into windrows and he would pitchfork it by hand onto a wagon and get it into the hay mow. His first baler was a stationary baler, which meant you forked it into the baler after forking it onto the wagon, and that was an improvement. By the time I came along, we had a baler that had a little bit of it was a belt baler, a little bit of a kicker that could make it onto a wagon, and then you had to stack it on the wagon. We proceeded from there to a John Deere kicker baler that could kick it onto a second wagon. It was fantastic. And then we went to silos, haylage, wrapped bales, bagged silage, all of that. That part of his life was very interesting, but the people part of his life was very interesting too. We, when the 3 children we had were grown and gone, they sailed off. Michelle came to live with us. Michelle is here with her husband and her kids. And she started coming weekends, visiting. When she was 7, she moved in permanently when she was 11. Temporary custody, the county called it, until she got married. A year later, I got a phone call at 9:30 at night. I have 3 of your grandchildren. I can't find their parents. I'm moving. I'm not taking them with me. What should I do? Walter had gone to bed. I woke him up. He said, well, tell her to bring them here, but you better make sure that you contact the authorities. So I called our local justice that they are not kidnapped. I have them. They are safe. Well, through the county, we got temporary custody of those 3 children. I still have them. They are Laura, Nicole, and Adam. They were a big help in setting things up here. And through all these children, which we never gave birth to, we have 14 great-grandchildren, many of whom are here today. They're the ones you're tripping over as you're trying to get them. But anyway, Walter, he was a good man, a kind man, an honest man. I remember one time a man came when we were early in our marriage, selling tools out of the trunk of his car. And they were really cheap. And we could really use those tools. And Walter said, no way. I said, Walter, they're cheap. No. So when the man left, I asked, why didn't you buy them? They were cheap. He said, they were stolen. Going to buy stolen property. He was honest. He was kind. He was loving. He had a heart that spread. Raise your hand if you lived any time in my house. His heart spread to all those hands and beyond. And we had a very weird relationship because we never had an argument. He didn't want to argue with me because he loved me. And I didn't argue with him because, as tough as he could be, he was a very sensitive man. And I'm okay, and I'm going to be okay. I had more years married to Walt than I ever expected. When we got married, he was 45, I was 21. I was teaching school. I was graduated from college, teaching school. And at the end of that year, my parents said I could marry him, but I had to finish the school year. I couldn't quit my first full-time job in the middle of the year. So I did that, and that spring we bought cows and we started dairying. But anyway, we had the kind of life we wanted. We could have had more money if I had stayed teaching. There's a lot of money in farming. I'm proof of that. We put it there. It's very hard to get it out. But we had the kind of life we wanted, and we raised kids the way we wanted to raise the kids. And I'm only grateful. I'm not heartbroken. I'll always miss him. but God gave us 52 and a half years of marriage when I didn't expect more than 35. Walter's passing was at home, peacefully. He had no pain right up to the end. The day of his birthday, when he turned 98 years old, he got up, came to the table, and he hadn't been able to eat anything other than liquids for a year or so. He had birthday cake made into a smoothie with milk. That was the last he ever drank. The last sentence he ever said was that morning, and his last sentence was, "I love you very much." After that, he lived 4 more days. He said nothing other than a few times yes or no, asked if he wanted a drink or if he was cold or whatever. But I have nothing but gratitude to God, and I'm grateful for all of you people who came to celebrate Walter's life. Amen. This is our grandchild, Nicole, who lives in Texas. And if you have Facebook on your computer or phone, you see her daughter every day.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I know many of you traveled a long way, and we are just so grateful to have so many people here to celebrate Papa. I can picture him standing and squeezing Noreen's hand and anxiously asking, "All of this for me?" Walter was a son, a brother, a father, an uncle, a cousin, but to many of the people in this room, he was just Papa. He was also a magician with his coffee and saucer plate. Anytime cousins or friends came over, we would all hover every time he had a cup of coffee to see the magic. He was a comedian with his one-liners. He was almost always the quietest person in the room, but when he spoke, you were either left laughing or filing away a nugget of wisdom. As a child, there was no better place than his lap. He would read us books and tell us stories. The arm of his chair was always the first to break because so many of us would just climb up and sit on the chair to be near him. He was always hiding candy bars in his cabinet for a rainy day, and if you were lucky, he would break you off a piece. He would get instant giggles when he rubbed his 5 o'clock shadow across your cheek and asked if he needed to shave. As an angsty teen, I found peace just by sitting next to him. He never said anything, but for me, it was the most calming place in the world. Whenever we thought we could get an easy yes for something we wanted, we would go to him, but he always said, "You better go ask Miss Wonderful." As an adult, he was always the first person I called when I wanted to share good news or talk about the crazy weather changes. When I came to visit, the best place to be was sitting next to Papa because he always held my hand and would jokingly ask, "Are you still my girlfriend?" He had done this since I was a little girl, so it was always a reminder that I always had a home to come home to. It was also fun just to witness Nana yelling from whatever room she was in, "That's my boyfriend!" One of the best things about Papa was that if you were willing to learn, he would teach you whatever he knew. He would rattle off information about crops and soil like it was no one's business. I am always very judgmental about corn crops because they better be knee-high by the 4th of July. If you were lucky enough to take a drive with him, he would give you a lesson on all the crops the local farmers were growing, and you would get a status update on their growth. He had a deep appreciation and pride for the farmland. He respected and was respected by all of the local farmers. He taught us all that hard work pays off, and the job isn't done until the tools are put away. If you stuck around long enough, he could probably teach you how to rebuild a whole tractor. He taught us good dental hygiene, because if you are not true to your teeth, they will be false to you. He taught us that we should always have on a good pair of sneakers in case we needed to run from the police. And if you're going hiking, you should always go with someone who you can outrun. Hands down, the best thing he ever taught us was how to love unconditionally. You can't talk about Papa without talking about Nana. Their romance was better than the movies. They were happiest when they were together. Papa was grateful for everything she did, and she did everything for him like it was the greatest act of love she would ever perform. She could have put burnt lasagna in front of him, and he would happily eat it while proclaiming, "Boy, you would pay good money for this at Brenda's," the local diner. He never complained about anything, and the only time we ever heard him raise his voice was if anyone else was disrespectful to Nana. He was always willing to go with the flow and would always say, "Whatever you think, ma'am." It didn't take much to make him happy, and he was always happy just to be at Nana's side. Because of Papa, Nana will always be known as the flower of Montana. I could go on and on about all of the nuggets of wisdom he shared, but we would be here forever. I always thought that he didn't teach me how to say goodbye, but in the weeks since his passing, I have come to realize that he didn't need to teach me that. The faith Nan and Pop instilled in me tells me that I will see him again. My heart tells me that he will always be with me. When I look out at this room, I know that he will live on through all of us. Thank you for being here, and I hope that you never stop celebrating the amazing man that our Papa was.
Good afternoon, everyone. Noreen, cousins, other family, friends, comrades. I'm John Clark. Walter was my uncle. I'm here today at Noreen's invitation, who asked me to speak briefly.
John.
Louder?
A little louder.
That won't take much. I'm here today at Noreen's invitation, who asked me to speak briefly and to honor Uncle Walt Wiggins, not only for myself, but on behalf of my late father, Jack Clark, Walt's cousin. My father was practically a member of the Wiggins household in North Arlington in the 1920s, 30s, and early 40s. He was close to Walter and his siblings and to Walter's mother, Mary. They were cousins and next-door neighbors with the Wiggins clan on the corner of Prospect Avenue and Hendel Avenue in North Arlington. My father lived immediately next door on Hendel Avenue. For those of you who don't have the family tree memorized, my grandfather, Thomas Joseph Clark, Uncle Joe to many, was older brother to Walt's mother, Mary. Thomas Clark and Mary Wiggins' father was Alexander Clark, my great-grandfather, and the great-grandfather of my cousins here today. Walt was born on August 6, 1924. My father was born on November 3rd, 1926, 2 years and 3 months later. My father's mother died from complications of childbirth within 2 weeks of my father's birth. My grandfather, a widow with 5 other young children at home under the age of 6, couldn't care for my father, who had health challenges and frankly was not expected to live. Thus, my father was shipped off from my grandfather's home in Kearney to his sister Elizabeth's home, she was married to Bill Moore, in North Arlington on Hendel Avenue, next door to the Wigginses. Thus, the two sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, were neighbors. My father was more resilient than expected. He actually lived. For my father, Bill and Elizabeth Moore were his mom and dad, but Aunt Mary was surrogate mother as well. He was very close to her. And while Nan, Mary, Walt, Ed, Jim, and Veronica were cousins, in fact, they were practically my father's siblings. I suspect that my father was at the Wiggins household as much as his own. Thus, the family tree doesn't tell the whole story. My father was practically a Wiggins, hence his closeness. My own direct experience of Walt and the Wiggins family started when I was a boy in the 1960s. My father, older brother, and I visited the farm in West Milford every year or so. Walt and his father, Walter, were always at work, and my father, ever garrulous, chatted with Aunt Mary for hours while my brother and I explored the barn and the farm. My strongest recollections then were of Aunt Mary's warmth, kindness, and ever-present smile, traits that Uncle Walt inherited. Her husband Walter's gruff demeanor, which scared the hell out of us kids. Uncle Walt was the quiet one. He was more in the background, and was overshadowed as Walt Sr., Aunt Mary, and my father dominated all conversations, while we kids stayed away from Walt Sr. At my father and Aunt Mary's urging, we made plans for my brother and I to come up and stay at the farm for 2 or 3 weeks one summer. Alas, that never came to fruition for a lot of reasons, not the least of which was the fact that my family moved to Florida during the summer of 1969. Fast forward to the early 1980s. I was living with my young son in North Arlington. My father came up to visit in November of 82 or 83, and we drove up to visit Walter and Noreen on the farm in Port Byron. This was the first time my father had seen Walt since approximately 1968, and my first time visiting Walt and Noreen as an adult. It was during this visit that I got to know Uncle Walt. My memories of that visit are dominated by the interaction between Uncle Walt and my father. Their connection was strong. They had known each other their entire lives. Their conversation, their banter was easy and warm. Their lives had taken dramatically different paths since their boyhood in North Arlington, but their closeness, their affection for each other, their happiness in reuniting was most evident. I saw in Walt the traits that I've come to know a bit better and to appreciate immensely. He was warm. I was relieved that he had not taken after his father personality. He was deeply interested in each of us and asked a lot of questions. He had an easy sense of humor. He was filled with one-liners, unique one-liners. He was bright. He was unaffected, unpretentious, and profoundly human. He had the same work ethic as my father, which was to just put your head down and take care of business without fanfare or complaint. Over the next dozen years or so, I visited the farm several times, most often as a designated driver for my grandfather and grandmother. We came up on at least 2 occasions as my grandfather approached 100, to see Aunt Mary, her 90th birthday, and a later event shortly before she died. My grandfather, ever the elder brother, sat with his little sister and lectured her relentlessly about self-care and the necessity of getting out of bed and doing things. Some of you in this room have had the experience of Uncle Joe Clark pointing his bony finger at you during a lecture. Mary listened to her brother with a smile and flatly ignored him. During each of these visits, of course, I took the opportunity to spend time with Walt and Noreen and their kids. Uncle Walt was remarkable in that he remembered so much about me and what I was up to. He would bring up in conversation something that we had discussed during a prior visit, often years before, about plans or career decisions that I had made, etc. I remember several discussions about my progress in law school in the 1990s. I have visited several times since then, often spending a part of an afternoon, usually deep in conversation with Uncle Walt and Noreen, and was always welcome to the house. Uncle Walter's genuineness and warmth always showed through. He was truly interested in me and delighted in any accomplishments, and always had a funny comment at the ready. He always asked after my father and my mother and my brothers, and often told stories, none of which I remember anymore, about the boyhood antics of Walter, his brothers, and my father. I last saw Walter approximately 3 years ago, when I came up just to visit. That visit was overdue. It was obvious that he had slipped since I had seen him last, understandably, of course. He wasn't sure who I was at first, but came around. I could see the lights flickering in his eyes as he remembered who I was and happily engaged in conversation and told more stories. I'm so glad I made that trip, as it was the last time I saw him. When Noreen and I spoke, she told me that he had died. I was struck at once with 2 emotions: sadness at our loss, our collective loss, but also the odd happiness and the triumph of living 98 years on his own terms since 1945, working at a job he loved until his late 80s, surrounded by his marvelous and devoted wife, lots of kids, grandkids, and great-grandkids. That's a successful life, truly a cause for celebration. It would be an exaggeration to say that Uncle Walt and I were close. We only saw each other occasionally, and those visits often were separated by years. To put it in colloquial terms, we didn't hang out. That being said, my memories of him in the past 40-plus years of occasional visits are vivid. He was a remarkably memorable person, particularly in light of his low-key, gentle, and quiet demeanor. He made a profound impression on me. I often thought about Uncle Walt and my father and their years growing up together in North Arlington, and I spoke to my father about them too. There were significant events in their childhood that formed them. They were small boys when the Great Depression set in and caused such extraordinary hardship, with families, the Wiggins family and the Moore family, scraping by, finding ways to feed households of kids. God knows the Wigginses and the Moores were not rich. These guys spent their youth and early teen years in times of privation, only to face Pearl Harbor in December 41, and World War when Walt was 17 and my father Jack was 15. I've long thought of what it must have been like for this simple kid, Walter, from North Arlington, with a dream of becoming a father who had lived through the Depression to see war break out when he was 17, and to be drafted a year later. Choosing the Army Air Corps with the intention of being a pilot, he ended up ultimately as part of the B-17 crew, drawing the short straw and becoming a ball-turret gunner. Imagine that. One day Walt was navigating teenage life in a small town. The next day he's in the Army Air Corps, learning the ins and outs of being on a bomber air crew. I'm not a historian. I do not presume to know much about Uncle Walt's military service. That is in my cousin's, Mike Deming's area. I know enough about the war to be awed by certain facts, like the life of a ball turret gunner in a B-17. There's a quote, Wikipedia. The ball turret was very small. In order to reduce drag and was typically operated by the smallest man of the crew, Uncle Walt. To enter the turret was moved until the guns were pointed straight down. The gunner placed his feet in the heel rests and occupied his cramp station. He would put on a safety strap and close and lock the turret door. There was no room inside for a parachute, which was left in the cabin above the turret. A few gunners wore a chest parachute. The gunner was forced to assume a fetal position within the turret, with his back and head against the rear wall, his hips at the bottom, and his legs held in midair by 2 footrests on the front wall. This left him positioned with eyes roughly level with a pair of 50 caliber machine guns, which extended through the entire turret, located to either side of the gunner. The cocking handles were located too close to the gunner to be operated easily, so a cable was attached to the handle through pulleys to handle near the front of the turret. It's an extraordinary environment. A tiny, cramped space, armed to the teeth, exposed on all sides but one, and a view, well, it had to be harrowing when the anti-aircraft flak started. For me, for all of us, unimaginable. He ended up in Italy on a B-17 crew that flew 48 missions, mostly flying over the Alps and dropping bombs on Germany. The conditions were horrible. The mortality rate of B-17 crews were crazy high, at least a 20% mortality rate, with ball turret gunners having a 60% mortality rate. The trip itself was miserable, desperately cold, and he was barely protected from it. I have flown over the Alps many times, south to north and north to south, and will do so again next Friday from the cushy berth on a modern jet. Marion and I will be warm, we'll have a nice meal, we'll watch a movie, and have a few drinks. Cushy at 38,000 feet. I often think of what it was like for Walter when I'm in the air, flying at relatively high altitudes in an unheated plane with below zero temperatures, crushing noise, and the threat of enemy planes and an anti-aircraft attack, and indeed death a constant companion. Miraculously and against all odds, he survived the war and headed home before the war in Europe was over. It's hard to fathom, but hard to underestimate at the same time how much this experience forged the character of Walter Wiggins from North Arlington, New Jersey. Major Richard Winters of 101st Airborne Division of the Band of Brothers fame said after the fierce fighting on D-Day that when the war was over, all he wanted to do was to buy a quiet farm and live in peace. I understand that Uncle Walt really didn't talk about the war until, frankly, recently. Perhaps the same thought was in his head when he returned home in 1945 and had the family move to West Milford when he became a farmer, living a life of peace and quiet. Damn straight. I understand that while he was in the Army, Walt sent money home to his mother, and she used that money to buy a cabin somewhere. And when Walt returned in 45, they sold the cabin he bought and moved to the farm in West Milford. Thus, at age 21 or 22, began the life of farmer Walt Wiggins, a life he lived for 75 years or so, quietly and in peace, with his loving wife Noreen and their kids, acres of corn, lots of cows, and the love and admiration of all who knew him. Goodbye, Uncle Walt. If you happen to see my dad along the way, have a chat with him.
Uncle Walt referred to her, Sister Mary's baby, or number 9, as I'm also called. I'm going to start this by borrowing from an old Irish saying. Actually, I don't really know that it's that old, or if it's really even Irish, but if you were lucky enough to be a Wiggins, Deming, or Nestor kid and raised by one of those originals, you were lucky enough. Not only were we raised with the incredible values that were instilled in our parents by Grandma and Grandpa, but we got to regularly visit the farm in West Milford. And the farm was paradise for a kid. In my family, unfortunately, we had our share of tragedy in the 70s when I was in grammar school. And so the farm for me was a safe space. It was again, and now for my husband. It was a place where a kid could be a kid, where you could put aside your troubles for the day and run and jump and pretend and do cool stuff, like ride horses, drive tractors, feed and play with all the animals. And it was heaven on earth for a tomboy like me. But one of the best parts about being on the farm was Uncle Walt, who was always there. He was strong, he was reliable, he was smart, he was funny, he was patient, he was unassuming, he was Uncle Walt. Hi, you want to join? He taught us things. He taught us things about the animals, what he was growing, what he was working on, and he let you help with whatever he was doing. He taught by example, and if he showed you something, and he asked you if you'd like to try it, and you didn't quite get it right the first time, he'd step back, cock his hat like he used to, he'd stand there and he'd look, and he'd kind of give you that look like, well, never saw it done like that before, and then he would patiently show you again. There was never a harsh word, there was never a sign of impatience, there was never a criticism, and I think that was sort of a metaphor for his life. He did things his way, and he led by example. So much so that my mom told me that his high school peers nicknamed him Pappy. Even as a teenager, he stood out as an incredibly grounded and wise beyond his years. He knew who he was, and he knew what he needed to do, and he always got it done. He took care of his family, including his parents, his kids, and his grandkids. He took care of his country. He took care of his land. He took care of his animals. And he did it all without question, all without complaint, all without boast. Of course, always with his flower of Montezuma at his side. He truly was the human being that we should all aspire to be, and one of the greatest human beings I've ever known. And I just want to tell Nicole and all of the other Wiggins kids that he really did practice on the Wiggins kids and the Uncle Jimmy and Uncle Ed's kids and the Nestor kids and the Deming kids for years before you guys came along. So we kind of turned them over in really good shape. So. But I do have to tell you one quick funny story where he sort of had a laugh at my expense in more recent years. And I was up at the farm for a visit with my husband and kids and my mom. We used to bring my mom up quite a bit to see him, and Noreen and everybody. And he wanted to take us up on the hill across from the farm because he was very proud. If you went up on the hill, he could show you all the land and in the front and the back and the farm. And as we walked across the street to start up the hill, he had his walking stick, and he asked me if I would like to. And at the time, I think I was in my early 40s. He was probably in his early 80s, and I assured him no. I was quite capable of getting up the hill without a stick, and so I made my way up through the important fact, waist-high grass, and we started up the hill. And of course, I had to show him how confidently I could get up the hill, so I got up there a little bit ahead of him. So when he got to the top, he called me over, and with his very wry smile, he explained to me that he really didn't need the stick to get up the hill either. The only reason he bought the stick was to beat off the rabid fox that he had seen in the area in case he launched a sneak attack through the waist-high grass. Like, I'm sorry, what? So I can assure you that my descent down the hill was much less confident, and I stuck close to the guy who was smart enough to be armed on the way up. And to this day, I don't even know if he was pulling my leg or there really was a fox around. I suspect there was not. And he was just teaching the city girl a lesson that if a guy offers you a weapon, take it. He was a good man, he was a funny man, he was a kind man. I really think he was the best of all the Wiggins kids. I call them the originals, all wrapped up into one. And I say this, that he really was one of the finest human beings I have ever met, and I don't think I'm ever going to meet anyone like him again. So it really is a pleasure and an honor to be here and share these memories with all of you.
I got the shortest list, but I probably got more to say. Uncle Walter, with five boys in our family, one sister, we probably have maybe a little different idea how things work on the farm. I have to start with, I'd love to go and talk with Uncle Walter, and I've listened to his story, and I've been listening for years. We lived up here, so I might have had more time to hear some of the things. But a lot of things that I wish I could ask my father. Uncle Walter was around for so long, you could ask him these questions and stuff. And I had a real interest of them growing up in the bungalow out in Newark, because when we were teenagers, my friends would go jump off the big rock in the lake out there. And when they stayed in the bungalow out there, I asked Uncle Walter stories, because if you could just imagine them staying out there during the Depression, their parents would bring them there, and with Grandma, when school got out, they'd stay there the whole summer. There was no toilets, no running water. This was just out in the boondocks. And kids, Uncle Walter said sometimes between the Clark kids, their Wiggin kids, and all the Wiggins cousins, he says they might have more than 30 cousins out there in the woods. And no running water, no toilets. It wasn't necessary. You grew up, and I don't think they thought themselves tough. This is what kids did. There before iPhones, and they actually had fun. And one of the things, I had an interest when we were teenagers. When Uncle Jimmy and Uncle Walter worked together, they would blow things up. They'd use dynamite. And I stayed there summers, and if you like fireworks, you know, the boys and girls and stuff, dynamite is exhilarating when you're a kid. And I stayed there one summer, and I think they blew things up that you could knock over with the bulldozer. Just that, I think as an adult, it was still fun to them. But I said to him, where'd you ever learn how to use dynamite? And he said, well, when they lived at the bungalow one year, Grandpa hired one of the fellows that lived near there to dig a well. And to dig the well, it was all rock, and they'd have to dynamite it. And Uncle Walter said this guy was smarter than he was, because he says he'd let me use the dynamite and show me do it if I dug out all the rocks. He says, so Grandpa paid him to dig the well, and he says, I got to blow it up, but he says, I dug the whole well. But that's where that came to be. And, you know, things that you learn along the way, things that might interest me that didn't interest Noreen. I think little boys have a big voice. They go through there. Growing up, Uncle Walter living in North Arlington, if you think of it, what are they, 10, 15 miles from New York City? Now, they might have had a horse and a cow out there, but in the city, they grew up, my mother, his Nan, his sister, and Aunt Mary, they went to New York City for things. They went to school. They weren't, my wife says, be careful, don't be calling them hillbillies and stuff like when we grew up, I think on the farm, we had a different view of what they were when they were young kids. When you looked at pictures of Grandpa Wiggins and people living in the city, he didn't have checkered shirts and, like, you know, what we think of Grandpa working with Uncle Walter. They looked like gentlemen. You know, when you moved to the farm, it was a different life, but things were different. With the horse, my mother said, and she meant it in a nice way, when Uncle Walter left for the Army, she thought he missed his horse more than he missed his brothers and sisters. But the animals, he had this respect for them and things, you know, and who's gonna take, I don't know who took care of the horse, it was my grandpa when they left. But there was goats, and they had things, you know, people probably talked about the Wiggins family in North Arlington. Noreen said to go over through some of the things in the Army. Uncle Walter was a staff sergeant, and he was in the 300th and 47th Bombardment Squadron in Italy. And in between bombing, when you were in there, you have downtime with the weather and different things like that. And you would never think Uncle Walter, I don't know, he didn't talk much about visiting Italy. There's pictures of him in there in Rome, all over northern Italy. And there's pictures of him riding a horse up in the, of course he made friends with somebody that had a horse who would be looked for. But he's with pictures with his buddies on the bomber group. And it's the enlisted guys, not the officers. And there's pictures of them when they're on leave in Italy and everything like that. But I don't remember that didn't sink in or mean anything to him. His mission, he talked flying in there, things that he never forgot. And I talked to him like 30 years ago about this, but talking in the last years, things that set in his mind, he remembered forever. He said every time he talked about it, he remembered, he says, this plane above him, somebody made a mistake, opened the bomb bay doors and dropped them right through the plane. And he watched, he knew these guys, watch your buddies go down, no parachutes. And these are things like that shape your, who you are, compassion. Other people sometimes it's misery and ruin your life and everything. I think he learned from things he did. He talked about guys' friendly fire was more prevalent. He says he thought way more than 25% of the planes going down were from friendly fire. Guys with machine guns. By the time you react and you're shooting that gun and the plane is going by, he said very rarely could he ever shoot his gun. You're in formation with 100 planes. And he says guys would lose that training that they were taught and start shooting at the German plane. And by the time you release it, he says the American plane went down with it. You know, and these are things that he learned, discipline, that when they trained, he understood why they were so hard on you for certain things that they taught you. And I think all through his life he had this desire to learn. He was an avid reader. He never did anything that he either didn't learn from someone else or he didn't read before he did it. A tremendous amount. He was more educated than what they could teach you in college because he had a lifelong desire to learn and improve. And I could see things when I was on the farm with neighbors, when people were doing something and he knew the correct way to do it, he would never voice his opinion unless somebody asked. He was never a braggart. Battle stars and medals he was due to receive, he always says, oh, the braggarts want them. And I had always thought that I would apply and get the medals he was entitled to, but I really believe he didn't care about me. He had battle stars for the Rhineland, the Balkans, the Apennines, and the Po Valley. And my father was in the 10th Mountain, fought the Apennines and the Po Valley, and he did the bombing runs, preparing the way for the infantry. And him and my father never talked about it. He says, your father was in Italy? The war was over, and it was a long time. He was a farmer, my father went on, and like so much in common that we had through our life. One thing my father did, the 10th Mountain had mules, and all our life my father never talked about it, but he had a big problem with the mules, and he never liked the smell of manure. We left the farm, and we had 5 boys in the car, and he had his head out the window. Something with the mules. Work ethic. I often thought when I was in a position at work and somebody didn't come to work and stuff, I didn't have much faith. You learn from your parents your work ethic, that the other person was Uncle Walter. If you think back when you had the flu and you're so sick in bed you can't get up, my motivation was always Uncle Walter out there milking the cows, because it was never anything, even if Noreen could help him. Very rarely in his life did that man stay in bed. And I learned, I didn't have the patience he did. I would think Uncle Walter, and I'm thinking, this guy's out there milking the cows and can't even come to work today. Always an excuse. Have the patience. And the other thing is Grandpa Wiggins, when people had this thing of this grouchy guy, I must be a little warped because maybe that just went over my head. I didn't care he was there, but that was never an issue. I never considered him the grumpy old grandpa. Remember one time we were throwing tomatoes, he gave us a bushel of tomatoes to feed the pigs. And he saw us out the window throwing, and he had a fit, but it just went over my head. That's a different, see, everybody sees things in different ways. With Uncle Walter, it's pretty universal, the type of man he is. his farming equipment. His idea was never to have the biggest John Deere out there. He didn't have something he couldn't pay for. When he was shoveling that hay in there, he probably could have taken a little GI, some kind of loan from being in the Army and bought something, but he went out and earned his money and worked it by hand till he could pay for something. Very rarely would he go into debt. I helped him fix things on the farm. I was a mechanic, and sometimes I couldn't understand why don't you hire somebody, and it would be, we can do this. It might take us a month, but hard working. There's nothing that that man couldn't fix. If you, today, like you grow up with people and people can hammer a nail in, I learned so much stuff welding, like with an arc welder, as much today they have big welders, a lot of options for doing things. He always had a way and a plan when you came there. If I came to help like on the weekend or something, he didn't just dream this up and look at it and think we're gonna do it. He researched it, planned it, and had a plan. And when he gave you the info, he hoped you were listening because you were on your own then. Because if he had to stay there and hold your hand when you were doing something, he figured he'd do it himself. But when we grew up, when we were kids, long before Noreen and we went to the farm, he hoped you learned from your father being in the Army and this, like with a gun. I can remember being 9, 10 years old and he'd say to Uncle Walter, "Can I go shoot?" And he'd look at you like, I don't know what he was thinking, but he'd say, "Well, don't shoot anybody until you were the gun and the bullets were, and you were on your own." And, he hoped you learned, you know, because he was a man of few words. When my brothers, we came there, and I'm sure when the Nestors came, we came with our brothers as we started driving. Our friends came there, we camped out there. Never once did Uncle Walt, I don't know what he was thinking. He never asked him because he always said basically yes, and he'd give you a few little directives what to do. But I can imagine sometimes when all these kids were out there, teenage boys, and going in the shop when Grandpa was there, Uncle Walter, Uncle Jimmy, sometimes Uncle Ed, it was like MacGyver. I can remember one time these guys were making, and it was probably Uncle Jimmy's idea, they were making this crossbow out of a leaf spring from a truck. They had a lever to pull it back, and they would shoot these steel spikes and shoot them right through a tree. And he helped along, but I'm sure like Jimmy was quite a bit younger, but always making or fixing something, and there was nothing these guys couldn't fix. A lot of times you would think, one time he said to me, one of the elderly neighbors had a silo, and they were going out the farm, he said, "We can have the unloader." And I climbed up in this thing, in this silo unloader, like, if you know, like they're forever broken on a farm, the ice, and when it breaks, you're up there shoveling. I went up there, this thing was older and worse than what he had. And he says, "But it's free." But another way, I thought Uncle Walter, I think you judge people how they treat their parents. And Noreen had to buy into this when they got married, but the care they gave Grandma, you know, when Grandpa died, I don't know if they would have ever moved, but when Grandma said she could move and they came up here. But Walter used to come in every day from the farm whenever you were there. And Grandma, once she got to the age where she was in a rocking chair, and first thing he'd say, he'd come into the house, "What's the trouble, Ma?" Every day. And, you know, they cared for Grandma, which is an amazing thing. The other thing, Grandma Clark, I always thought, all the pictures of Grandma Clark, that's my grandmother Walter's grandmother, she's born in Ireland, and all the pictures, she's got this long face. And I said, "Uncle Walter, wasn't she ever happy?" He says, "You know how many kids? Until she was an old lady, she had kids. He says, "You look like that too." But I used to think with Noreen and Walter, kids. It was never a problem. And like, I don't know if Uncle Walter ever complained to Noreen, but you never saw this. Growing up where Uncle Walter was like, you were on your own when you came to, yeah. And when we used to ask, "Do you want to do such and such?" he'd say, "Ask the boss." Noreen was the boss. And she was pretty liberal too, like you could and couldn't do around there. And all these kids, it was just an amazing thing. People, they would do things that you'd say, "I would never let that happen in my house. I don't have like what they had." You know, everyone's different. And meet wonderful people. You'll pick a pair. That's what I always think. It's always Noreen and Walter.
I know everyone's getting a little antsy, so I'm going to read and I'm going to be quick. I am Mary. I am Noreen's sister, and I have witnessed the 52 plus years of their life together. Walter and Noreen took me in at a time of my life when I was lost, really lost. I was a lost child who needed them, and they were there for me. Walt, in his quiet way, supported and taught me and the many children that came their way valuable life lessons. But please realize my story of being saved by Walt and Noreen is not unique. There are many in this room that have the same story. What did Walt teach us? He didn't teach with words or lectures. In his humble, quiet way, he showed us the essence of love in his love for Noreen and all of us lost and orphaned children. He taught us the value of hard work and how hard work is the path to true fulfillment. His work ethic was a bit unbelievable, as Mike commented. No weekends, no holidays, no vacations, sometimes 16 hours a day. But as Confucius wrote, if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. And Walter truly loved what he did at the farm. And the woman who worked by his side for those 52 years. Walt also taught us the importance of maintaining integrity, absolute honesty, and moral uprightness. He lived a life of the highest standard, and although he wasn't a religious man, he modeled the image of Jesus Christ as well as anyone I have ever known. He lived the lesson of humor, adding a necessary dimension to our lives. He was always ready with a joke that truly made me laugh. Walt also taught us to use the gifts we had, and he used his gifts well. He was brilliant, again, as Michael touched on, in many ways. Mechanical, medical, agricultural, you name it. When Walt needed to learn about something, you would find him in his chair, poring over a book or a magazine, learning, always learning. He was a role model for many, and his legacy will live on in the many, many lives he loved and supported. I'd like us all to say a prayer together to send to Walt from the many hearts that are grateful for his generosity and wisdom. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Now, I know he's probably up there rolling his eyes, but anyway. If anybody else would like to have a word about how Walter touched your life, now's the time. Come on up.
I just want to say one thing. I wore a suit and tie today just to tick him off because he told me numerous times, don't do anything for me. I don't need nothing when I'm gone. So this was for him.
and I remember my first memory of Pop getting up to go. We would go to Laura's for sleepovers for her birthday on the farm, and like someone else had mentioned, it really was, for a city kid, the farm was the best place ever. And I woke up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night and got pretty scared because here's Pop sitting at the table by himself, drinking his coffee out of his saucer. So the next morning I said, Nicole, someone was, or not Nicole, I'm looking at you. I said, Laura, some old guy was sitting at the table last night and I don't know who it was. He goes, that's just, she's like, that's just Pop. I said, I've never seen him before. He goes, yeah, because he was always working. So every morning, every year that we'd have the sleepovers, I would expect to get up and there would be Pop, just quiet as could be, just drinking his coffee out of his saucer. And we would never see him at meals. He would always be in and out, or be in and then bed before anything. And then I honestly probably had more conversation with Pop in the last 10 years of his life than I did in all the previous 25 years of spending time at the farm and everything. And him and my older daughter share a birthday. So we're always like, yay, Pop made it another year, Pop made it another year. We were so excited this year when we told Olivia again. And it's just so great knowing Pop and Nan, and like everyone said, they really were a pair. You didn't know one without the other. And it was, just woke up and I'm like, Laura, someone's sitting at your table, I don't know who it is. She's like, oh, that's just Pop, and his little saucer of coffee. So, thank you.
Anybody else? Well, I would like to say thank you to all of you, one and all, relatives, friends, neighbors that are here, to honor this amazing man. And I would like to thank you for coming and just enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Amen.